Why did the Japanese decide to revive their military again? Look at the list in front of you. This is a list of the world's largest arms exporters, and you will find America, France, Russia, China, and Germany among them. Try to find Japan among them. You won't find it there. Japan, which is considered the third largest economy in the world, a technologically advanced country over the past decades and evolved in any industry you can imagine, is not present in the military industry sector. Out of the top 100 companies in the sector, you'll find Japan has only about 2 or 3 at most. So, why is Japan missing compared to France and China? I'll tell you, it's not missing anything. Japan did this by choice. The Japanese constitution itself killed the defense industries with its own hands and imposed a ban on arms exports as well. Imagine where Japan could now be if that ban wasn't in place. According to a secret memorandum circulated by Japanese defense companies in 1988, they said that if the ban were lifted, Japan could capture 45% of the tank and artillery market, 40% of the military electronics equipment market, and 60% of the military shipbuilding market. This is what Japan could have achieved and could have been ranked higher on the list I showed you. But to this day, the constitution has not changed, and the arms export ban has not been lifted. Japanese defense companies have entered a recession phase until they exited the international defense industry. Regardless of the accuracy of these forecast numbers, these figures can give you an indication of where Japan would be if it hadn't killed its defense industry with its own hands. When did it kill it? It killed it at a time when China was growing and significantly strengthening its army, and at a time when North Korea was testing new missiles every now and then, passing over the heads of the Japanese who just watched. This situation did not please some Japanese, and for the first time since World War II, they made radical changes in military doctrine and decided to revive the Japanese military again. What is this all about, and what does changing military doctrine mean in numbers? Why did this all happen? What is the connection between Taiwan, Trump, and the Treasure Islands with this change? Could Japan eventually possess nuclear weapons after these major changes? With Japan's surrender and the end of World War II and its occupation by the United States, America drafted a new constitution for Japan. The most prominent feature of this constitution was the dismantling of the Japanese military and imposing restrictions on the size of the armed forces. Restrictions on many types of weapons even eliminated Japanese military production of weapons. All of this was to ensure that Japan would not rise again militarily, and this was reinforced by Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which prohibits Japan from having the ability to wage war. Japan is forbidden from firing a single shot abroad. Only self-defense forces were allowed with a number not exceeding 300,000 soldiers. Their mission was limited to defending Japan only, and their weapons range should not exceed 200 kilometers, meaning their weapons would not reach any other country. Since then, Japan has been a peaceful country, and its people have, for decades, rejected the idea of war and armament. This was to the extent that in 2015, former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe pushed for new laws that might allow Japanese forces to fight abroad. At that time, the Japanese took to the streets for the first time in such numbers since the 1960s. Honestly, when we look at the protests and this rejection, we might say that the Japanese people are willing to remain like this for the rest of their lives without a powerful military force, and they are unlikely to change their minds. But it seems that nothing stays the same, and I will tell you how they will change soon and how they might even reach nuclear weapons. But before I tell you how they will change, let's first dive into the strong motivations that are changing the Japanese this way. The first thing we see is North Korea and its launch of dozens of missile tests, some of which pass over the heads of the Japanese. North Korea launched around 100 missiles last year into the seas surrounding Japan. Japan is unable and doesn't know what to do. Okay, forget about North Korea. Do you remember Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan? The visit that set the world on fire. And since then, everyone was holding their breath, fearing that China might start a war to reclaim Taiwan. But China didn't do that at the time and was content with launching missiles that eventually landed in Japan's economic zone. At that time, everyone focused on America and Taiwan and what happened and what would happen to semiconductors and big companies, and we forgot about Japan, a country that is only 150 kilometers away from Taiwan and could find itself dragged into a conflict with an adversary that spends more than 4 times what Japan spends on its army. And before you tell me, well, why doesn't Japan just stay out of it and avoid China and Taiwan? I'll tell you, that's indeed the opinion of some Japanese, but if an invasion happens, according to America's commitments and promises to protect Taiwan, America will be forced to participate. And here, America won't participate alone. Japan must allow America to use the American bases located there. If Japan does that, it might make China launch attacks and strike American bases in Japan, meaning it will start hitting Japan itself. This is what former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe confirmed in 2021, saying that a state of emergency in Taiwan would create a state of emergency in Japan, and consequently, a greater state of emergency for the Japanese-American alliance. This means Japan might get involved in any future conflict between China, America, and Taiwan. This is what the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, talked about in numbers in a report issued in January 2023. This report included a war simulation based on several scenarios, and the center tried to predict the kind of losses that could occur if China invaded Taiwan. It found that in most scenarios, Taiwan would be able to repel the Chinese attack and remain independent. But this would be after support from the American-Japanese alliance. However, if this happens, it will result in significant losses for Taiwan, China, Japan, and America. What concerns us from this report is what Japan's losses might look like. Japan might lose between 112 to 161 military aircraft. It might also lose 26 naval ships, which means almost half of its total naval fleet could be lost. There is also the possibility that military bases, airports, ports, and other logistical centers in Japan could be struck by China. According to the center, these scenarios and losses assume that Russia and North Korea are out of the equation. If they get involved, all these numbers will change. As for the economic losses, according to a report from The Economist, Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines will be the most affected in the event of a conflict between Taiwan and China. These 3 economies are the most vulnerable due to their proximity to the Taiwan Strait and the significant trade relations between these 3 countries and China. And of course, the most important factor is that these 3 countries are America's allies and have treaties among them, making them the biggest countries that would suffer huge losses. If Taiwan falls into China's hands, or if a conflict begins, 90% of Japan's energy needs and 60% of its food supplies will be at risk, according to a government statement. Furthermore, if China takes Taiwan, it will not just take the island in front of you, but it will take all the islands belonging to Taiwan, including the Senkaku Islands under Japanese control, which China claims belong to Taiwan. This means, in the end, these islands and Taiwan would belong to China. All the scenarios we've discussed involve America participating in the defense of Taiwan, which would drag Japan into the defense or conflict. America's involvement here is confirmed by President Joe Biden, who has made very strong commitments. But there's a very big problem. What if Donald Trump returns? This would be a very big problem and scary prospect for Japan. If Donald Trump returns to power, which is becoming increasingly likely every day, you can't predict what might happen with Donald Trump. You don't know if Trump would actually defend Taiwan, Japan, or even any of America's allies. This topic is hard to predict with Donald Trump, so Japan needs to plan for the scenario where America might not be there to defend Japan or Taiwan. This is not my opinion. This is what Yashiro Matsuda, a professor of international politics at the University of Tokyo, said. Japan needs to consider a scenario where America is not there to respond to any Chinese attack on Taiwan. Thus, Japan must revive its military again, not only to protect itself but also to force China and others to think twice before taking escalation steps against Japan or its allies. This is already happening through changes in military doctrine by doubling Japan's defense spending by 2027. Instead of spending 1% of its GDP on defense, which is about $45 to $50 billion annually, Japan will double this amount to reach 2%. Remember, Japan is the third largest economy in the world, with a GDP exceeding $4.25 trillion. This means that by 2027, Japan might spend $320 billion to build the largest military mobilization since World War II. By doing so, Japan will have the third largest defense budget in the world after America and China, having previously been in 10th place. Japan also plans to acquire 147 F-35 aircraft. Do you hear that number? The price of one aircraft is about $100 million. And it's not just the F-35s they want. They also want some very advanced helicopters and drones. Japan intends to have a nice assortment of these. Japan will not only rely on America to get aircraft, Japan has also made an agreement with Britain and Italy to develop a sixth-generation fighter jet before 2035. This is to surpass Chinese and Russian fighters and possibly surpass the American version. And I say possibly here. At that time, their version would compete with American aircraft, most of whose sensitive manufacturing secrets America keeps to itself and doesn't give to anyone. America doesn't give these planes to just anyone. Japan, for the first time since World War II, is considering acquiring long-range offensive missiles. Do you remember I told you earlier to remember the number 200 kilometers, that their weapons should not exceed a range of 200 kilometers around Japan? Japan now wants missiles it can buy from America, and they are also working on their own version of long-range missiles capable of reaching North Korea and China. And keep in mind here that Japan's consideration of long-range missiles might be important if they consider nuclear weapons. You might ask, could there be Japanese nuclear weapons? I'll tell you that officially, there is no announcement of Japan intending to possess nuclear weapons. In fact, there is public opposition from both the government and the Japanese people to something like that. But also, keep in mind that Japan is the fifth largest holder of plutonium, with approximately 45 tons of plutonium. According to some experts, this is enough to make 5,000 nuclear bombs. And before you say that possessing the material is not enough to make nuclear bombs, you need technical capabilities to know how to make something like this. According to some experts, with Japan's current capabilities, plutonium could be converted into a nuclear weapon in just 6 months. Is the 6-month figure an exaggeration? It seems that this number is not too exaggerated. According to an American official familiar with Japan's nuclear strategy, 6 months is not an exaggerated number for a country with an advanced nuclear engineering infrastructure in Japan. In fact, some say that Japan could make this bomb in just 2 months. So, in terms of capability, Japan has the ability, and it might not be far-fetched that we hear about Japan entering the nuclear weapons arena, especially after China abandoned its minimum nuclear deterrence, which was around 400 nuclear warheads. China is now seeking to have 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. Something like this might one day make Japan actually seek to acquire nuclear weapons. The only thing that could prevent this is the Japanese people themselves, who are currently opposed to such an idea and against the concept of nuclear weapons. But here we also say who knows what could happen in the future that might change the Japanese people's minds. People's opinions can change easily, and we have a lesson in the Japanese people themselves. When it was once unimaginable that Japan would change its military doctrine, it led to protests in 2015. But the same people 7 years later in 2022 did not welcome the changes in military doctrine warmly, but they accepted these changes without the same resistance as in the past years. Remember an important point. The Japanese people's previous aversion to defense matters or even owning nuclear weapons was based on their sense of security due to the presence of the Americans and the treaties with them for protection. They were also the nuclear umbrella and defense agreements that Japan had with many surrounding countries. This made the Japanese feel safe. But again, we ask, what if Donald Trump returns and continues his ambiguous statements about defending America's allies? At that time, America's allies, like Japan, would start feeling threatened when there are doubts about the Americans' presence to protect them. In moments of doubt and feeling threatened, they might do anything, just as they started changing their military doctrine and spending huge amounts of money, something that was previously taboo for the Japanese. Tell me your opinion on what might happen in the coming period. Could Japan actually enter the realm of nuclear weapons since they have the capabilities? Could Japan continue to arm itself successfully, build a strong army, and return to the military power it had during World War II?